historical description of the faces. I was wondering if there is some differences when it comes to traditional response, because you mentioned that when it came to ISIS, none of the traditional scholars, like literally none of the traditional scholars supported whatever they came up with, because it was like a modernity age phenomenon. But what would be their response to the first wave, for example? Were they more receptive of the first wave of jihad, global jihad?
It's part of that. It's a great question. Part of it is counterfactual, because with the assassination of Azzam and the rejection of the Azzam model to be implemented in Kuwait, it never really got off the ground outside of Afghanistan. And certainly the Afghan jihad was widely supported, right? And it's a very traditional form of jihad, of trying to expel a foreign invader from Muslim lands. So there was strong clerical and broader Muslim world support for the jihad in general in Afghanistan. As I said, we never, the al-Qa'ida, al-Sulba, this jihadi international idea of Azzam never really got the chance to be tested outside and to see whether it would get clerical support. The fact that Azzam, again, was an Azhar-trained cleric, he was more traditional and more careful in his, he was quite radical, but he was, you know,
playing within the rules, I guess? Playing
within the rules, at the very margins, and maybe stepping over now and again, but playing within the broader parameters.
So what was his opinion or stand towards suicide bombing, for example? Like, would he
this is a great question.
That,
so, that's a great question that I don't think we have a good answer to.
Okay.
Because Abdullah Azzam was really the author of, in the book, what I call the cult of martyrdom. So he laid out in his writings the sort of the, again, I refer to it as the cult of martyrdom, the necessity. And he makes this complicated argument that the realization of Tawheed, of the oneness of God, can only be fully realized in battle and when you are facing the potential of martyrdom. Death. That is the only time, according to Abdullah Azzam, that a person can have the full realization of the meaning of Tawheed. So, again, this was like Sayyid Qutb, this was an argument for permanent revolution, permanent jihad, because every Muslim has the right to have that full experience of the meaning, or at least every Muslim male, of Tawheed. So this was essentially an ideological justification for martyrdom on a perpetual basis. Now, as far as I know, Abdullah Azzam never weighed in, because he was killed before it became a big thing, really kind of. It had started to become a thing in Lebanon and Iran, and at least in the Shia world, the suicide operations before he was killed in the 1980s. But his ideology kind of went right up to the line to justify, you know, martyrdom operations, suicide bombings, but never crossed the line. But other people could legitimately interpret what he wrote and take that step.
Interesting.
You see, your first thesis about Sayyid I think you are not the first person that I've read saying that Sayyid was the kind of precursor for all this extremism and this total jihad. But I just would like to challenge this thesis of yours, because if you look, because you quoted Mu'allif al-Tariq, Marsul, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you were saying that like he was trying to say about this perpetual jihad in this Marsul. But like Milestone to me is a textbook for all Islamic workers in the world. So Islamic workers doesn't mean that they have to be jihadis. Islamic workers mean like people like me. I consider myself an Islamic worker. And I've read the book many times. again and again in Malay, in English, it was translated by IFSO, the Islamic Federation of Muslims Organization. And I found it that if you really wanted to encourage Muslims to go out for jihad is as you mentioned, I think he would have ended his book with something else. It's not a chapter from his Fizr Quran on Tafsir of Surah al-Buruj, the constellations. He wouldn't have ended it with that. To me, when he ended it with Surah al-Buruj, the constellations, meaning to say that he was trying to say that if you are a believer, you have to know that your faith will be tested, and you must be faithful to it. You must be able to withstand the persecution, and you must be basically believe in the oneness of one God. To me, he could have quoted many of the verses in the Quran. He could have quoted minal mu'minina rijalun sadaqu ma ahadullah alayhi wa minhum man qada nahbahu wa minhum man yantazir wa ma badalu tabdila. He might have quoted that verse and encourage Muslims to go out and fight and attain shahada. So to me, I wasn't trying to defend Said Qutb, but I think from my reading, I did not tend to become a jihadist. Right. And I just want to see what you say about this.
I think it's fair to say that Said Qutb was being, first of all, he never, the sort of go out and become a martyr was not Said Qutb's idea. I think it's fair to say he was more careful in Ma'alim fi Tariq, knowing that he was in Egypt and he was walking a fine line. He'd just been released a little earlier by the intercession of the Iraqi president, Gamal Abdel Nasser. So I think he was being careful. But if you look at, there's a clear radicalization that Said Qutb goes through. And if you look at the revisions, for example, of his work in the shade of the Quran, it goes through several iterations, and they gradually become more and more radical over time. And it's pretty clear that his prison experience, right, that he was imprisoned, as were basically all Ikhwanis in Egypt, or at least all the leading ones. Many of them were tortured. There's some debate as to whether Said Qutb personally was tortured in the Egyptian prison, but he certainly knew lots of people that were. That prison experience clearly radicalized him. You saw that in his other writing. So that informs my reading of Ma'alim fi Tariq, that it's not like the earliest version of In the Shade of the Quran, which is, tafsir, it's commentary essentially, and well-informed commentaries. He was not a cleric, but he was a very well-read individual. So I think he was being careful not to be as explicit as Abu Najib Bakr, for example, in Idarat al-Tawahush. Just the graphic calls for violence, but I think putting it in the context of the evolution of Said Qutb suggests that it really is primarily about a call to arms for regime change. Now, I've had this ongoing discussion with a scholar who specializes in Said Qutb about some of these issues, and he's of the I won't mention his name here because I don't want to blame him for something that maybe he would disagree with, but a very well-informed scholar who did make the case that he thought Qutb did not think that sort of the revolution was going to happen tomorrow, that this was a generational, it's a generational struggle, long-term vision, but that he would concur that violence, that Qutb had concluded that violence had to be part of it, that the system was so strong and so corrupt that you could not get rid of it through normal political processes.
No matter what his intentions were, obviously.
Well, it's been translated into many different languages. It's available online in many different languages. So it's, in fact, there was a story not long ago in the last stronghold, if that's the right word, the last few villages in Syria where ISIS was, and there was this story about a couple of ISIS fighters who had been killed, and lying on the ground next to one of the fighters was a copy of Ma'alim fi Tariq. So it's still in circulation. It's still being read quite widely in certain circles.
What would you say about, there is a thesis ongoing on in terms of having some gender perspective when it comes to this kind of movement of rage or age of rage.
Question, yeah.
So the gender perspective is that there is this kind of male pathology, right, happening related to the cinema, hero archetypes.
Rambo.
Exactly, Rambo, and there is a lot of other hero archetypes, video games culture as well, that makes these young people see, using your terms, jihadi cool, and be attracted to it. Of course, like you mentioned, there is also female element, but a female element has been very insignificant so far. By far, for all the instances we've seen in Norway, in New Zealand, in Sri Lanka, everywhere, it's always the male hero driving this kind of crazy operations.
Yep.
So linking it to modernity crises and all this, well, what would you say about that?
Absolutely. I think there's two points. The first is I think it's fair that to say that radical jihadi groups, not just global, but I would say this is true for local jihadi groups, or at least some of them, tend to be highly, highly patriarchal. They, sort of much more so than in the general population. Control of the female body becomes an important part of that ideology. And then the second thing is sort of an example of that, and again the jihadi cool kind of argument, is for young men to go join ISIS, they were essentially promised endless sex as well, right? They could have a bride, or they could have concubines, and again, the Yazidi women, for example, were widely used as sex slaves. And I think this is part of an element of that ideology and an element of the jihadi cool, that not only can you go out as a young warrior and do video games in real life and be celebrated for it, but you can also have endless sex, which maybe you couldn't have back home wherever you came from. So this is an issue that doesn't get talked about a lot, but I think it's very real.
Going back to the sociologists and psychologists, I guess they should actually tackle this kind of, because there is definitely a male chauvinistic, male schizophrenic element, megalomaniac kind of element there.
Yeah. And going back to Said Qutb, he wrote this, it was a serialized newspaper piece, and then it got put together in a little booklet on his impressions of America. He was actually lived for 2 years in the United States in the late 40s, early 50s, primarily in a dry town of Greeley, Colorado. And he visited New York and Washington and California and elsewhere. But most of the time in Greeley, Colorado, which was a utopian Christian community built along the railroad outside of Denver. And then he came back, and if you look at his depiction of women at church dances in Greeley, Colorado, I mean, one can draw all kinds of sort of Freudian conclusions, frankly. It's a bit bizarre, but I think it gets to some of the points that you're talking about.
I think in the case of Qutb, it's more of a cultural shock, because obviously he came out from a very close conservative society, and then in his book he describes the dancing part and all that. So
Right.
I think it's a bit different, but what they are telling now, these modern psychologists, is like this is a very real issue.
Yeah.
Because like nowadays you don't have ISIS anymore, but they will find other means and other mediums to sort
Yes.
of self-express themselves,
Yeah.
which is very dangerous.
Yeah. But Sayyid Qutb, and I 100% agree with what you're saying. With Qutb, I mean, he wasn't, he was no longer a boy from the village, right? He was well educated. He was, he was a big fan of classical music, for example, and quite familiar with a lot of things Western, well before he got on his ship to go to New York. Yeah.
The waves you have described before it seems to me, I may be wrong here, but it seems to be all from the Sunni tradition.
Yes.
And is there a follow-up question, is there a global jihad component with the Shia? Because in this country, at least to the best of my knowledge, a lot of people tend to tie up the Islamization process in Malaysia to 1979, not what you have described, Afghanistan, but Iraq. So I'm not clear on that. Second, all these four waves, particularly in Malaysia and Indonesia, what kind of response has there been from this part of the world? If you have insights.
As to the first question, I think it's simply a factual statement. The global jihad has been a Sunni movement up to that. I mean, I don't think there's anything particular in the Sunni version of Islam as opposed to the Shia version of Islam that necessitates it to be that way. It's just a historical, quirk that over the last 40 years, the global jihadi movement has been a Sunni movement. There are clearly lots of Shia jihadi groups, organized groups that use violence under the banner of Shia Islam to advance a political agenda. Hezbollah, obviously, is the most famous one. The Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq, the Popular Mobilization Forces, may usefully be described as another example. So there are plenty of Shia jihadi groups, but none that have that immediate global focus that you've seen in these four waves. In terms of the Southeast Asian and Malaysia, Indonesia, part of why I'm here is to learn. It's a big part of why I am here, is to learn about these kinds of responses, the milieu in which they take place. There clearly has been some terrorism that I would define as global terrorism that has occurred in Southeast Asia. And I think Malaysia and Indonesia are just as prone to this fourth wave stochastic violence as other countries. There is a lesson to be learned here about, much of the fourth wave kind of violence, this is not a military issue. This is good police and intelligence work, sharing, communicating. There was this in the post 9/11 world, but particularly after the attacks in France a few years ago. It was just kind of common sense, common knowledge that American intelligence cooperation with each European country was frankly much better than it was between the European countries. So the Americans had lots of shared intelligence and cooperation with the French, with the Germans, with the Belgians, the British, and others. But sometimes amongst themselves, they wouldn't. The French wouldn't share intelligence with the Germans. There's turf wars and turf battles and what have you. So, there is, I think, lessons for all states, including in Southeast Asia, about the importance of cooperating on some of these important police matters without getting too repressive, which is sometimes the downside. Yeah.
on different sort of sides of the discussion. But the first one goes back to the issue of gender. And we don't see women, at least from what I heard, we don't see women up until the present in terms of the ideological backbone of these movements. But I'm wondering...
Very recently, right?
Yeah, and
Much
fewer.
more recent.
Fewer. Okay.
More recently
Okay.
and fewer.
Perhaps you can sort of give a little context to that. But going back to the latest wave and the sort of the anonymity that the internet provides,
Yeah.
is that, and not just the anonymity, but the wiki, how do you just...
Wiki narrative.
The wikiness of these movements. Is there potential for women to be involved now, hiding behind this veil?
Yeah, and you have seen that more recently. I think it's a fair statement to say that overwhelmingly these global jihadi groups have been, male-based, male-dominated. There have been some female involvement, and there, again, particularly in Europe, there have been females that have been very much involved. I mean, for example, in the Paris attacks I mentioned a moment ago, back a few years, that killed 200 people or some such, a little under that. One of the people involved was, she was of Moroccan heritage, but commonly referred to in the press as Jihadi Jane as opposed to Jihadi John. And she ended up blowing herself up with a suicide vest, and one or two of her compatriots. No French police were killed in the explosion that I recall. Samantha.
This is considered the third wave, right?
Yeah, but this was not fourth wave. This was third wave. The group organized attack. But just looking for sort of females involved in global jihad.
But more towards the ideological side rather than the being a soldier.
The operational side. That's I can't think of a significant female ideologue of global jihad. Period.
And would there be some way to discover if there were now that they can operate through?
So this is the in terms of the fourth wave and the internet and social media, the ability to remain anonymous. This is a great point, and so there are a lot of posts out there that we really don't know who the author truly is. And some of them may be counter-terrorist specialists, in Brussels or Washington or wherever. This is why it's widely noted that jihadi chat rooms never got anywhere, because people that really knew stuff wouldn't go in chat rooms, and people that went in chat rooms didn't really know anything. They just spouted off. And then half the people in those chat rooms were either academics studying the chat rooms or law enforcement trying to round up people. So it was kind of a non-starter.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy or something.
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, exactly. But I think the point of the anonymity with the new information technologies makes identifying kind of who's behind what just that much more difficult. Exactly. Even the technology's ability to cocoon people in their own language, their own little parts of the world. It used to be English, which is why Indian, Bangladeshi, Pakistanis in the West were very prominent in these jihadi chat rooms and in the discussions and various leaflets put out and this and that, simply because they tended to have very good English, and some of them were quite radical. And so they were prominent. You've had others, Anwar al-Awlaki, the American citizen who was also from Yemen, who was killed in a U.S. airstrike in Yemen, was very prominent in trying to help radicalize English-speaking Muslims.
I'm not sure if I missed something that or I was taking notes while something was going on in the conversation, but the nihilistic group, or just the fact that these are nihilistic, apocalyptic groups, do they have any sort of ties, connections with non-Muslim groups? In other words, do they see any reason to work together with groups that are not Muslim groups and just, to undermine the general system in the whole world?
Yeah, no, great question. I don't see evidence of that, at least not yet. I mean, each of one could make an argument about connections between the Red Guards in the mid to late 60s in China and the Khmer Rouge a decade later. There are some ties there. But in terms of Muslim global jihadi groups reaching out to white nationalists or some other potential nihilistic anti-system groups, I don't, this is probably a better question to ask to sort of intelligence folks, but I haven't seen any evidence, as a scholar I've not seen evidence of any significant, at least, reaching out to unrelated. I mean, in fact, this has been a problem. Abu Musab al-Suri noted, he's the guy that coined the term Salafi jihadi, and he did it not as a compliment, because he was so frustrated with the people he called Salafi jihadis in Afghanistan, primarily Arabs, that refused to work with the Taliban because they didn't agree on every single point of theology. And Abu Musab al-Suri was sort of a big tent jihadi, and he wanted the jihadis to, even if they disagreed on this or that little point, he wanted them to work together to create a bigger impact at the end of the day. So he was very critical of these folks. So this has been, if anything, this has been the problem up to this point, is the fragmentation within the movement as opposed to uniting with other groups that are totally outside the Muslim world. So I certainly haven't seen evidence of that. It's significant.
And how was Bin Laden received after his death, or after he sort of disappeared from the scene among the jihadis? Did they have strong critiques of him? Did they revere him?
A little bit of both. I would say that amongst a pretty small segment of his followers, that he is personally revered in some ways simply because he came from a very rich, powerful family. He could have lived the life of luxury, had yachts and vacation in the south of France and done all of that. And instead, he decided to live this austere life of the ascetic, in caves in Afghanistan, if you will. Although his house in Pakistan
We
was
don't
not
know
bad.
what kind of life he lived, right?
Yeah, exactly. That was probably
The camera
decent.
was there, but behind it,
This is true. This is touche. That's a good point. But so, in a sense, the opinion polling I've seen, and just in talking to some folks, it seems to suggest that personally there's a decent amount of respect for him, just what he gave up to give to the cause, even if you thought the cause was off, was a wrong cause. There's some sort of at least grudging, if not more than grudging, admiration for him personally. A lot of jihadis thought that he was a disaster to the global jihad movement, that his decision to attack the Americans directly may have destroyed the global jihad movement, were it not for the American fiasco going into Iraq and sort of creating a new wave all over again. That they thought that, just again as a generalization, as an individual, there's respect for what he gave up. As a strategic thinker, mostly criticism, at least as I read it.
That's an interesting distinction. Any other questions or comments?
Just wondering what any tie-up between the separatist movements in Philippines and Southern Thailand with the global jihad? Do you have any?
Again, I'm here in part to learn. So what I have read a little bit of the Marawi episode in Mindanao, in southern Philippines. And that, as far as I can tell, that seems to be, I mean, there's a little bit of a cover story about ISIS, and there were some radicals, sort of ISIS-oriented radicals that were involved, no question about it. But it appears, from what I've read at least, that this was mostly about clan rivalries, control of the local drug trade, and the sort of presidential politics getting played out at the local level. In other words, it was much more of a local phenomenon than a global phenomenon, even though they waved the flag and talked about it in a certain way. But the actual, as I understand it, the actual driving forces behind that episode were much more local in their orientation than global.
So would you then just put the recent Sri Lanka incident as part of the fourth wave or the third wave?
I don't think we know enough about it yet. At least I don't, and there may have been stuff breaking in the last few days as I've been on travel. The distinction is this: if ISIS as an organization was directly involved in the planning, the building of the bombs, the synchronization, the planning, the choice of targets, the choice of dates, right, Easter Sunday, if you had, because groups are always more powerful than individuals or small cells. You get a lot more bang for your buck, if you will. So if ISIS as an organization with its institutional knowledge and has lots of knowledge about how to build bombs and how to do these sorts of things, if they were directly involved in it, then it would be a third wave attack. If on the other hand, and there have been reports that I've seen, I don't know if they're true, but there are reports that I've seen that at least a couple of them had worked with ISIS, had gone to the caliphate, had fought, had gained skill sets there, perhaps including bomb making, and then come back. They didn't need any ISIS instruction, no logistical coordination. They were already radicalized and they wanted to do something. If that's the case, then that would be a variant form of a fourth wave stochastic violence.
Although there's some comment about ISIS making a claim that you may have taken away.
Yeah.
Yes, they made the claim and had the picture, right, doing the bio.
To me, that didn't make sense because they don't exist anymore. So they came out and they are making a claim that they don't exist. So this make it as a fourth wave, I guess. Because they don't have a territory anymore.
They don't have a territory, but again, it would be the difference between a sort of skilled organization that knows how to do these sorts of acts of violence and just a ticked-off individual who radicalizes, gets into his truck and drives over a bunch of people in the name of. And typically the first are much, unfortunately, they're much more able to kill more people than a self-radicalized person with a gun or a car. And I mean, self-radicalized individuals, knock on wood, up to this point, haven't been able to build good bombs. Right? You look at the Boston Marathon bombers, self-radicalized, and they went online. Al-Qa'ida put out this pamphlet about how to build a bomb in your mother's kitchen, literally the title of the article. And they talked about how to use pressure cookers and this and that to build a homemade bomb, and that's what they did, these two brothers. And they set off these two bombs in the Boston Marathon. They were very weak bombs. They did kill, I think it was 3 people, injured some more, but they're not the kind of blast that you saw in Sri Lanka, for example.
That required a lot of organization.
Yeah, that's a much higher skill set than the self-radicalization of an individual, or in this case 2 brothers, would end up producing.
And then going back to the U.S. gun shooting in the schools, gun violence in the schools is pretty much self-radicalized, nothing to do with organized groups. So
yeah, but typically it's not political, right? These typically are criminals, people that have psychological issues.
maybe male pathology.
Maybe a male pathology, and they decide to go in and shoot it, but there's not a political agenda behind it. I mean, for example, the Las Vegas shooting, not a school shooting, but this country music concert, we still don't know what the motive was. We don't know if this guy who killed, what was it, 57 or some odd people, if he had a political motive or if this was just a pure criminal act for no particular reason. I mean, sort of nihilistic violence in the meaninglessness of the word of nihilism.
Goes back to what you said earlier. I guess we should be wrapping up with this. Thank you so much, Dr. Glenn. It was very streamlined and very insightful. We appreciate your time with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Close it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.